about that.
I was waiting, yes, now this one and this one.
Good.
Okay,
We're
so
away.
here we are interviewing Richard Stringer on the 10th of December 2012 at his home in Toowong. I'm John Macarthur and I'm here with Deborah van der Plaat and Janina. Richard, I gather Deborah and Janina have already interviewed you
Yes.
fairly extensively, but we were interested to, because I remember a year or so ago we found some photographs of yours that Ian Sinmo passed on to me, which were from this exhibition that you held in 1967, and we have the poster for it here, Queensland background, and at the time you told me and the students some stories about that exhibition and your intent, and we're interested, I guess, in general about architectural culture in the late 60s, and we've been talking to a few people who were involved with the student conference, which was sort of in opposition to the Institute conference, and your exhibition seems to be an important part of that, so I wondered if you could just tell us about, I think it'd be interesting to hear also about what Brisbane was like when you arrived, what you made of the place, and how you came to make that exhibition.
All right, well, there's a few things there. First of all, as a correction, those photographs that Ian Cinnamon had were not from that exhibition.
Oh, okay.
They were a later exhibition. The second one, you used the word a student convention in opposition, and I was interested you used that word, and there was a little bit of that, I felt, certainly from my point of view, in that I felt that there was a lot of mutual support going on amongst the architects at the time, and I think some needed a lot more support than others. And the thing that had struck me was just when you looked at the silent buildings around from previous generations of architects in Brisbane, that some of these architects, current architects, were not matching up to the standard. So I felt if I had this exhibition called Queensland Background, it would just be a little eloquent testament to the environment that they were now operating in, and wherein you could compare the two. And so the poster, of course, is not what you'd call well, it's not a poster, it's a leaflet, not what you'd call an exemplary piece of Queensland architecture, but to me it spelt a lot about the grassroots architecture in Brisbane and Queensland, which were fascinating me. That one particularly was in the city on Boundary Street, just across from the main roads building. Main roads building wasn't there at the time, that came later. So that was, I think, disappeared about 5 years after the show or something like that. But the student convention, I think early student conventions are exciting because they're all full of new enthusiasm and new optimism and all that sort of thing, and there's a sort of a degree of euphoria in the discovery of the world when you're a student and how you're going to get it sorted out and all that sort of thing. And the chief thing I remember was Tony Gwillim, who came and was very, what shall we say, very much at one and at ease and full of enthusiasm with the students, and that enthusiasm was what went. Now I can't even remember much now about what was said. I just remember that things were possible and we were going to get them right.
Gio Ponte was the other
Yes, that's
big
right.
visitor. Do you remember him speaking?
Yes, I remember. Again, I can't remember now what he said. I do remember he made little hats which he distributed, and I think the girls got these little I think they were paper hats or something that he'd made as a sort of a frivolous exercise, which is rather nice because I think all architects should have to make a hat at some stage in their life. You know, it brings out the creative instinct. I mean, the more you think of it, you realise that it has overtones of dealing with pliable and plastic materials. You know, it's not four walls. It's and so it's a bit of an adventure and an opportunity where there are no rules to let your hair down. You excuse the pun. So I was remembering feeling a bit sad when I heard he'd died and so forth, and thought what a nice guy he was. That's Ponty.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Gwilym was too for them, but Gwilym, you know, was more aggressive. Ponty was sort of the amiable wisdom, whereas Tony was the let's go out and get him type. Yeah.
So did they just give lectures or did they run workshops or
Can't remember.
a combination of both?
Yeah, I certainly remember it as lectures. I can't remember if it was workshops or not. But they certainly were there for activities, social activities and that sort of thing. They weren't remote figures.
And what did you make of the theme of the student conference? It was called City Synthesis. Did that...
Well, the fact that I've forgotten it, I think,
speaks volumes.
Yeah.
Perhaps heading back a bit, having missed the first interview, I've forgotten when you first came to Brisbane, what the circumstances were and what, I guess, general impressions of what you made of the culture then. Have you covered this the other time?
I'm not sure.
We touched upon it,
We
so it's
did
okay to
touch
go.
on it.
Yeah.
Well, I came in 1959, first of all. I was still a student at Melbourne, final year at Melbourne was a year where you had to go out and work in another office for 6 months, and then you'd go back to Melbourne and do your thesis, and then you'd start looking for a job. The Melbourne course, well, I think university courses in those days were 3 semesters, which, not semesters, terms I should say, which later became the 2-semester system. I quite liked the old system because it was, what was it, the first term nobody worked, first term freshers worked, second term nobody worked, third term everybody worked. And it was quite a good system in the architecture school there. First year suddenly you found not only that they were in university, but they had to organise a ball for the whole school, which sort of had the effect of coalescing that group of students. And second term was devoted to the review, where the whole school worked as a unit. And then third term, of course, everybody had to pass exams. But it was a good system because it did enable you to deal with other faculties and so forth. There wasn't the continuing exam pressure. Exams were at the end of the year, and up to a certain point you could avail yourself of all the resources at the university, and that's not so easy now. But anyway, I came up to Brisbane mainly because it was somewhere else, and we'd had guests stay with us during the Olympic Games who were from Brisbane, and so it seemed a good idea to come up here and see what I had to offer. And I came up with a friend, Danny Mazzaros, who was another architecture student, of course, His dad was Andor Mazaris, a sculptor, and Danny's brother, Andor's son, is now a sculptor in his own right in Melbourne. And Danny was a sceptical Hungarian. But anyway, Brisbane was a bit of an outpost in those days. You know, there were dirt streets and things of that nature. And culturally it was seen as pretty well the desert. There was not much to do. I can remember wandering around the streets rather aimlessly and looking in a window and said, "Danny, look, there's quite a nice floral carpet." And Danny, the Hungarian cynic, said, "Yes, but it's a floral carpet." So anyway, we of course made contact with other students here, and we had great fun with them, and we were in Scoop 2, which was a university review in opposition to the student union review. It was oh, hang on, no, it wasn't. I'm sorry. No, that was a student union review. Later on, the architecture reviews came in, and they were.
Do you remember the students that you met?
Yes. Let me see. There was, well, the two principal ones were John Hellman and Tony Skane, who were both law students, and they did the scripts and so forth. And then there were other people. If I sat down and thought, I could probably.
But you weren't mixing with the architecture students?
Oh yes, yeah. Well, that's what it was like in those days. Yeah, you could in fact join forces with other disciplines, well, there was a lot of fun and games and so forth, but to give you exposure to other attitudes and so forth. I suppose in later life too, it meant that you had acquaintance with potential clients. Anyway.
And you found work?
Yes, I had written up to Jim Birrell. I knew Jim Birrell's work through the Melbourne University had a thing called Cross Section, a little leaflet, which would look at current architecture around Australia, and so we were aware of the scene in Brisbane, and so I wrote up to Jim Birrell and asked if I could do experience there, and that was when he was working with the City Council, and he said yes. Danny, he worked with Conrad and Gargett, and we lived in a little terrace house up on the hill at Spring Hill. It's still there behind the RSL. And so that was quite fun. It was the first time I'd come across Queensland humidity, and I can remember it was an attic, and there was a window at one end and a window at the other end, and I can remember sitting in a wicker chair with nothing on, with the breeze just going through. It was quite luxury to do that. So anyway, what happened there? And then we had to return. I did a thesis on Queensland Art Gallery, a new gallery for Queensland. Melbourne only had design theses. There were no written theses at that stage. And so you had to produce your magnum opus. First of all, you had to do research while you were away, finding out what the client needed and all that sort of thing. And I saw Laurie Thomas, as I remember, when he was the director at Queensland Art Gallery when it was up at Gregory Terrace. Well, looking back on it, I think, like a lot of things, in hindsight, you realise that you didn't quite have all the facts although at the time you thought you did.
Were you did you know other people in the arts scene? Were you involved in the Contemporary Art Society? Or,
No,
not
so much, no. I can't remember any involvement with the art scene at that stage, no. So then we went back, and so that was my introduction to Brisbane. I remember, I think I told you about how I came in on the train in the last interview, didn't I? So it was, it certainly expanded my horizon a lot. And later on I came back, not altogether deliberately, more by chance, but I found it was a good place. And it's improved since too, I might say. Although at the moment I'm a bit worried about it.
In '59, when you came up, that was just for the year or a half year?
Half year.
It was for half year.
Went
so
back in May.
I had to write the dissertation. Yeah. Were you here when they released Buildings of Queensland, the book?
Yes. Oh no, hang on. That was nice. Yeah, that's I was here. Yeah, and that was one of the things that got me thinking about the what do you call it, Queensland background exhibition, because I felt that it was that 59 book had a few buildings in that would have been better left out, but it was everybody being nice to everybody and that sort of thing. So that was one of the things that prompted me to do that exhibition.
Mm-hmm.
Which ones would you cut?
Well, I felt there were certain practices that were rather stolid, that were not, they were expediency architects rather than innovative architects. And I'd done a lot of, we had a couple of good teachers in Melbourne. One was Fritz Janina, who I think I mentioned, and the other one was David Saunders. I mentioned David Saunders. So it meant that I had sort of, David Saunders in particular, got me interested in just exploring what was already around. And down there was Burley Griffin and Harold Desbrownie and Robert Haddon. So that was quite rich grounds down there. I discovered Robin Dodds when I came up here. Sydney seemed to be a different flavour again.
So was David Saunders, he was teaching history, I guess?
Yes.
He was teaching Australian history?
Well, history of architecture, I might say, yeah. Yes, he certainly spoke about Australian architecture.
So you were very interested in the regional differences when you came here?
No, I discovered that when I got here.
Right.
And later on I decided that the only genuine Australian architecture was in fact the Queensland House. Everything else had come from somewhere else. But even the Queensland House, of course, is not without its influences, you know. But it was a genuine regional style.
So which year was it that you moved back?
It was 1963, I think. I think it was October the 2nd, 1963, when I crossed the border for a fortnight.
And you were working again with Jim?
Yes, and I worked again with Jim. Initially I worked with Cusick, Edwards and Bissett, actually. I didn't like that practice. I felt that practice was based on expediency and financial considerations, and they were not really much interested in inspiring people or whatever. I think a symptom of it was that they were throwing out Sid Cusack's books. Now Sid Cusack, who was the previous Cusack, what was it, Cusick?
Yeah, I don't remember.
He died by the time I got here, but he had originally had the practice. Cusick, Edwards and Bissett, I think it was initially. Then when I was there, it was Edwards and Bissett. and they were just throwing out Sid's books, and Sid's books, some of them were quite good, and I dared to salvage two that I thought in particular were very good. They were literally going to the dump. I think that sort of there was a sort of raw earthiness about Brisbane too. It was a little crude, I felt, for wanting a better word. The humour was a lot more basic.
You mean people's interpersonal behaviour, like
Yeah,
the humour's cruder and
yeah. And the other things that I found interesting were the students' idea of a good weekend was to go down to Surfers Paradise. I thought, oh wow, let's go down to Surfers. Oh, that's great. Let's go down to Surfers Paradise. And what did they do? They spent all their time in the Surfers Beer Garden. And I thought, well, you could have stayed in the beer garden up here. Why go to Surfers? And there was sort of that element about Brisbane,
sort of blokey drinking culture.
Blokey drinking culture.
Yeah.
And so anyway, other architects I met here were John Railton and David Rossler, and we still have a friendship going, and that's it's almost like a confessor relation. I think every architect needs a confessor, and we sort of have a three-way sort of a reassuring system, or whatever you like to call it.
As a young professional, what did you make of the students in Brisbane? And Bob Riddell's told us that a lot of his fellows at QUIT were completely boring and all sort of back inside and just wanted to be in business, but a few like Haig and himself and so on were doing Scarab and So what were some of the lively students? Do you remember? Were you teaching at all?
And well, I did later on come in tutoring in design, when Bill Gregg was doing out the first year. Bill was still alive?
No, he died a couple of months ago.
Oh, because he just disappeared. Yeah.
He'd been very unwell, I think.
Was that it?
He was quite depressed, I think.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
I'm gone. So anyway, no, I enjoyed Bill's company and Isabel and so forth. And, all sorts of fragmentary memories. I can remember Bill coming in one day talking about the influence of television on kids and saying how the kids knew in fact that it was garbage. And it was that incident in South Vietnam when the war was on, where the guy shot the suspected Viet Cong in the head. You know that song? Well, that was actually on television. And he said his two boys rushed into the room, white-faced, and said they'd just seen a man killed on the television. He said through all the television gun, cowboy and war films and all the rest of it, the kids knew that it was all just a movie. Suddenly when they saw the real thing.
That's that famous photo where you...
It wasn't a photo. I understand it was actually a movie.
Still.
It's a still.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. Well, I this is to the best of my you better verify that. But certainly don't have that on the girl, the napalm girl, sort of had the huge impact. So anyway, Bill Gregg, tutoring, and what the question was what?
I was thinking about the student culture at the time, and whether any of them were lively and who the interesting teachers were.
Well,
Bill Carr was about then too.
Yeah, well, Bill modelled himself, I believe, on Fritz Geneva.
Right. Had he been taught by Fritz Geneva as well?
No, Phil knew him. Phil was a member of staff at Melbourne Uni, and he knew Fritz. So there was no direct... He observed Fritz teaching rather than he was the recipient.
Right.
Another person at the time was Balansani, or he came in a bit later, but he, I'm not sure Ballard had much to do with with Fritz. So anyway,
So what aspects of Bill Carr's style do you think derived from Fritz Janina?
it was the business basically of throwing you in the deep end and let you work out how to get to the other side. And of course, when you get to the other side, you've explored all the possibilities. Whereas if you just teach somebody from a blackboard, they've only got one solution. And so that was the Fritz thing, and it caused much frustration, of course. And there was a leap of faith I felt with Fritz that if you have said, I don't go along with this, I just want chalk and talk, well, you didn't do much good. You had to be part of the adventure. And it was very stimulating, and he was very supportive. And I still do certain things now because of Fritz. You know, I have a dislike of higgledy-piggledy architecture, mainly because of Fritz wanting to sort everything out. And what was the other thing about him? Oh, just at the end of a year, I used to like playing with other students and all the rest of it. And so I never got particularly good marks. But I got through every year and so forth. And I think the staff, they didn't like me that much, but I know they hated others. But
Casting forward to 67, were you involved in the Institute conference as well as the student one?
No. I'm not. I'm very much on the periphery if I did do anything.
And we know that Jim Burrell was at the student conference. Was Jim involved in the Institute conference as well?
I can't remember.
I have to ask him, I guess.
Yeah. But you see, well, the thing was, Jim and Philip Conn and Jim, Laurie Cully, Philip Conn and I had just gone out. And so
when the practice was set up.
When the practice was set up in the valley. And so we were very preoccupied in doing everything we could to get it viable and running. And so I felt that I was not being altogether a good member of a partnership in that I decided to have an exhibition, but anyway.
All right, let's cut to the exhibition then. How did you decide? And
I had got back in the days with David Saunders and everything. I borrowed my dad's 35mm camera, gone around photographing Griffin and Deborah and so forth buildings. Also, I was quite good on the school of Griffin, the other people who'd been interested. But the 35mm camera wasn't much chop, and certainly I put in a couple for Architecture magazine, wasn't Architecture Australia, and they'd never done any good. And it became apparent to me that I'd have to have a proper big camera, like a black cloth type camera. And so I started taking these photos around about 1966, I suppose, with that camera. And when the partnership was first formed, let me see, hang on. That's right. I was married that year, and so there's conflicting pressures too. When you get married, there are certain things you've got to do. And so initially, when the partnership was formed, briefly, about 2 months or something, I think, before I got married. I'd have to check that out. But and Laurie Cully went up to Townsville to look after the James Cook First Hall of Residence. I followed him up in around about October, I think it was, said to Margaret, we just got this house, which had made it possible for us to get married, in fact. I said to Margaret, you stay in the house and I'll go up, and that will mean I'll come back sooner. But if we both go up, we might finish up there for a considerable and long period of time. So anyway, I returned by that Christmas. What was the question again?
I was just thinking about how the exhibition came
Oh,
out, how
yes,
you decided to have one.
Yep.
And you
So I was
talking about your
photographing.
interest. You bought a large plate camera.
Yep. No, well, it was a large film camera.
Large film camera.
Was something else. A 5" by 4" Linhof, an old one, which takes cut film. So I'd rushed out to Ravenswood and had a wonderful time at Ravenswood on the weekends and other places, taking this thing with me. And so I'd already started, some of the. So I already had a little collection of photographs of things I'd enjoyed around Queensland, and the exhibition.
So it was like Ravenswood, Charters Towers.
Yep.
At Townsville itself.
Yes.
Where else had you been at that stage?
Well, I drove around a fair bit around that region. Well, as far north as Ingham. Can't remember I actually had anything from Ingham in the show. And out to Charters Towers and didn't go south much. North always seemed to be beckoning a bit more. When this exhibition came up, when the Institute, the 1959 book and the convention came up, I looked at it and thought, yeah, well, there is another side of Queensland besides the side that the Institute is presenting. So I did the thing off my own bat. It was in Sutton House, which was opposite the Queen's Park, I think it's called, where the Treasury Car Park is and underneath it.
What was Sutton House?
Sutton House was I think it was 2 stories. It was in fact the Sutton family who had owned it initially, and one of the Sutton girls had married I think it was Tony Burke's wife. Anyway.
But they were running it as a gallery, or was it just a space you took over?
It was a big studio space which could be a gallery. It was lined with mirrors, actually. The walls were mirrors.
What's for a dance studio?
Well, it could have been used as a dance studio, yes, it could have been. But it was a flat area and about, I'm no good at dimensions, be about 20 foot by 100 or something like that, or maybe a bit more. And that, a friend of mine said, I could get you in there, and so that's where I went. And I had to look around and find people who would sit in the exhibition, whilst I was in other places. And I can remember that didn't work particularly well because one of them got sick of sitting there and went away and closed it. And when I got there was a sign on the door from some Melbourne friends saying, "Where were you?"
So how many prints did you show, and what sort of format did you print them in?
60 odd sheets. They were mounted on cardboard. They were black and white. I printed them all. And they were 16 inches by 20. And they were hung. I think I punched holes in the corners, mounted on card they were, and hang them from picture hooks in front of the mirrors. So it was not the ideal visual experience because you were competing with your own reflection if you weren't in front of the picture. I did try photographing every exhibition I've done. I've tried to do it, get a record of what it looked like.
Installation shot.
Yeah, installation like I do with the IMA.
Yeah. Do you have an installation shot of this one?
Yes, I did, but unfortunately, that I think I've rescued it. The early negatives I had were in fact on cellulose acetate, which Ilford and Koga kept very quiet about the fact that cellulose acetate deteriorates. It's not as bad as cellulose nitrate, but cellulose acetate breaks down. So the actual film is okay, or the image is okay. That's on gelatin. That's fine. It's the base that it's on that's the trouble. And to get it fixed up, it is possible. Chicago Album Works has done a lot of work in that area, rescuing old historic photographs of Walker Evans and so forth. And it is possible, but one of the ingredients is raw alcohol, and it's very time consuming, very labour intensive. And of course, when you've got thousands of them, it's out of the question. So copy.
You still got the negatives?
I've still got
but they're too fragile to print from.
Oh, it's not so much that they're fragile, they sort of finish up like that.
Oh.
They shrinks. You've got to try and flatten it if you can. And so what I do is I scan them with a scanner that's fairly forgiving, because it's not a flat plane, it's a three-dimensional object. And I can show you one if you're really interested.
But have you got usable copies of the images you showed at background?
Yeah, I think I've rescued those. There might be a bit of work still needed on the copy, but others, there's so many of them that when people are interested in something, that's the one usually that will get rescued.
Yeah.
Other ones that I've thought are really I'm fond of, I've got to. Others that I'm fond of, I still haven't got to.
Well, speaking of what you're fond of, were there particular images that you thought were more successful?
Oh yeah.
Do you want to describe them to us?
Well, Charles Towers, one of them was an optometrist, Stacey and Stacey. I've rescued that one, which was in an old house across the road from the Catholic Church, with a picket fence around it and so forth. It was quite a grand house. The guy who built it must have had some money. There's now a terrible service station there, and that service station, if they haven't demolished it by now, I'd be a bit surprised. It really looked quite decrepit the last time I was there. So that was one. Ravenswood, the cemetery at Ravenswood, actually, the monumental aspect of the cemetery. My influences, one of which I'm revisiting at the moment is Piranesi. And thinking how architects owe him so much, not just inspiration but anguish as well, because you can never build one of them. That sort of thing. But I keep looking for that moment, and I've discovered it.
So you had a folio of the Piranesi prints, did you, back then? Or?
Oh, no. Oh, what, a book? You mean genuine?
Yeah. No, I meant a book. Yeah. We actually...
No, it's
when you said an influence, you mean like at the time you were taking these photographs?
Yeah, I sort of had this... I mean, Piranesi's... A lot about it is about space, where there's no masonry or anything, It's... So you're sort of looking for that grand sculptural thing that is so elusive. It's anyway.
Piranesi was also interested in the ruins, so was that sort of informing or motivating your
most of them,
travels through Queensland?
That's right, yeah. But it's not just that. There was another guy who influenced me, a fellow called Rolf Beanie, B-E-N-Y. He was a Canadian.
Great photographer.
Yeah, and I was very struck by his first book in particular, Thrones of Earth and Heaven.
I've got a couple of them.
The Pleasure of Ruins was the first one. Yeah, and then Thrones of Earth and Heaven came later. You've got a copy.
I've got a folio of Benny's.
Lovely photographer. But I was interested in how he managed to do it, and one of my friends said, well, a lot of it was in fact the lithography, where you were able to achieve certain effects. But nevertheless...
So back to the exhibition, it was your first outing as a photographer? First solo exhibition?
First solo, yeah.
And was there an opening party?
I can't remember now. Well, oh yeah, there was. Yeah, because I can remember we got grog from the Treasury Hotel, and we were uncertain about how much to order, you know, and so we had this liberal supply of it, and of course there was some left over, and I went back to the Treasury and said, well, you said you'd take the surplus back, and they said, did we? And well, what a verbal agreement's as good as the paper it's written on. Yeah.
Did anyone speak at the opening?
Yes. Lucille, the ballet, was in town, and Nuria Rands opened it. And Nuria Rands couldn't speak English.
Who did it?
Nuria Rands. Lucille. Do you know Lucille? Heard of Lucille? It means Little Lewis in Spanish, but he was a flamenco dancer. He had his company, and I'd sort of met them in Melbourne through my dad, and when they were up here I was in the wings photographing from the wings. I used to do a bit of stuff from the wings actually.
So he opened your exhibition in Spanish, didn't he?
She did.
So she...
Well, she made me, you know, I just thought how beautiful she was. I admired her from the wings. And, you know, she was from Catalonia, I think, actually. So she came along with the PR guy from the ballet company, and she said something like, I declare this exhibition open. I'm going French there. Well, I'm no good at Spanish. And that was it, you know. But, you know, for all of it, she was a lovely person, you know. It's, yeah.
Did you get support from the local community? Who came?
Oh, well, I don't know.
Did Cummings and Lack?
Because I was never there. I can't remember who I invited to the opening. It would have been architects and things, friends that I knew and so forth. But I just sort of let it be known. That was the only. It was a fool's cap flyer, not an A4. That was the only thing I printed, and that was one of my things. I was interested in lithography. How you see, one of the problems with photographs is that if they're not reproduced properly, they're horribly grey and uninteresting and so forth.
Yeah.
And it's nothing like Roloff Benny, who had lithography to Temps and Hudson to look after it. And so I was thinking, how do you beat this? If you can't beat it, maybe you join it. And so I thought going to a tonal dropout where you just had black and white, there was very little way they could mess that up. You know? And so that was the idea of that. That house lent itself to, you know, the getting rid of all the greys. And the lettering was in fact letraset.
And the little pamphlet was distributed at the student conference, obviously, but
yeah.
was it also distributed at the institute conference?
Can't remember. So, yeah.
Was the exhibition reviewed?
Can't remember. I don't think so. No, I wasn't a particularly good organiser. Oh, really? I never have been.
Well, we can certainly try and find it.
Yeah.
A career email you'd think would come.
Yeah, I think so. We'll have a look.
Yeah.
But do you sort of remember any reaction to the exhibition from anyone?
No, there wasn't much at all to my memory. No, I can't remember any reaction at all. I think possibly the message might have drifted through to some people who preferred not to say anything. But no, there was never anything said yay or nay that I can remember.
I find it interesting. The title is a photographic essay of possible influences on present day building. How did you go about trying to make those connections? Was it just photographs of the older buildings, or did you include newer material and try to make connections? Or
No, I didn't have anything specifically contemporary architecture.
Mhm.
No, it was more about, this is the environment that this convention is taking place in, and you're getting all the current stuff,
Okay.
but this is the other stuff that's round that is worth looking at, and if you choose to compare it with what is happening now, it was the David Saunders technique actually, which was he would never actually say something was good or bad. He would say, yeah, was Burley Griffin influenced at all by Haddon or Anir or whatever? Did they, choose these building materials because they were available or because they could import them or in spite of or whatever? And he'd ask all these questions at the end of his lecture, and then he'd say, I wonder. And that would be the end of a lecture, which was a very nice way, I think, of finishing.
Building further on Deborah's question, you said that you'd been taking photographs for about a year and you chose to show 60. Did you have specific criteria as to which photographs or which buildings you showed?
Well, basically, I felt that they were the best. There were things like, you go on.
There were specific characteristics of the building that you thought were more relevant?
I felt that they were architecturally desirable, but I mean, that thing there is architecturally desirable, even though, I think one thing architects hate is the expression architecture without architecture. I think they like to feel they have a mortgage on it. I find that I suppose I see architecture as sculpture, basically, which I think most architects would say as well, wouldn't they?
Oh, they might not say that, but I think a lot of them act like that, yes.
You're looking, and I mean, at the Friday night dinner at the Institute, Alice Hansen read out quotes from Oscar Niemeyer, where he was sort of rubbishing Korb, form follows function and so forth. And I thought, he didn't get the message, because the function is not just eating and sleeping, and the function is living and breathing and enjoying and so forth. And I thought, the machine for living possibly suffered a little in translation into English. But to me as a student, I thought, oh yeah, that fits. Delight is part of the living process. It's that's by the by.
When you refer to architecture without architects, were you looking at the work of Habraken or Turner, or was it John Turner wrote that book?
That came later on.
That was later on?
Van Rudolph.
Rudolfsky as well, yeah.
And also, what's his name here, an architect in Sydney, married Maria Gazzard. Don Gazzard.
Was it in any? Do you think what you were doing, pointing out that there is architecture without architects, was it in any way influenced by international trends? It's basically.
I wasn't aware of that, but I mean, clearly I've got that feeling from places, So I mean, I have. Well, perhaps. See, Roloff Beniosto's stuff he's done is all sort of significant architecture.
Bill Carr, in one of these publications, or was it in a talk that Bob Riddell was telling us about, was giving students the idea that buildings like the one you're showing, which are pre-cut timber houses, were the origins of modernism, and they're prefabricated factory-built buildings effectively, and that there's a sort of direct lineage between later 19th century prefab timber construction, what architecture should be doing today.
I agree with that.
So you recall those ideas being about at the time? Was that the kind of thing? I just noticed
certainly I can remember talk about factory construction and so forth, and how comparing costs, with housing produced in a factory and taken on site, how in fact it cost more than something that the spec builder would put up. so there was that aspect. What was it? Say the question again.
Well, just so, because the image on the poster shows the sort of exposed, braced kind of construction, which is the local sawmilling companies like Campbell Brothers were actually pre-cutting these things as kits.
Yep.
And Bill Carr was teaching his students that this is like the origins of modern architecture. It's industrialised building processes.
I think so. I mean, this house here, this is done. I mean, I've done a few things to it, but basically this house was constructed on a module. You know what the module was? It was a sheet of asbestos.
Hardboard or asbestos, 2,400 by...
Yeah, and that was
by 1,200.
the motivating thing of the whole house. That you wouldn't have to cut anything. So anyway, but also I think Don Watson has done terrific work in talking about Suter and the origins of what a lot of sort of things I thought had in fact come up from the ground, in fact turned out to have Suter's hand behind them, and Donna Sinster talked about another guy whose name I've forgotten who preceded Suter in producing some of these exposed stud work buildings.
It was someone who worked for the railways. You gave a talk recently.
That's right.
About someone who was designing railway trucks with a similar kind of system.
So that's all fascinating.
So when we look at this student book from the 60s, it's got pictures of Archigram and Walking City next to your pictures of Queensland houses, and it seems like
I think I
incongruous kinds of interests of the students.
I supplied. I was. See, there were students in Jim's office and so forth who I was, very. Is that Bruce Goodson? No.
No? You reckon it is?
I can't tell. There was Jack Kershaw, he now is. There was a lot of that stuff.
Was Bruce Goodser in the office?
Yes. Bruce was... I wonder why I first struck when I met Bruce. He was so outgoing and flamboyant.
I guess this contrast, you get people like Tony William and Fonte, and then you've got the Archigram for Walking City, and then the Queensland House. And it seems like, nowadays they seem like alternate kind of ideas about architecture, high tech, and then sort of like historicist
on the other hand, you think there's to me they're similar,
They obviously were equally interesting, risky things to do in 1967.
Yeah, Phyllis. No, I thought I did actually supply them with photographs.
About the exhibit, of the exhibit.
Yeah, I thought they had a big montage thingy that they were handing around. I think I supplied photographs for. So that was my contact with the students basically through Jim's office. And at that stage we're all students.
Was climate a big issue when you were thinking about climate? Were you thinking about climate when you were sort of photographing these houses and trying to push them? Because these houses have become very strong.
I did feel that they were suitable. I told you my experience about sitting in a wicker chair. And so, no, I was aware of climate. I was also aware that when you're on a veranda under a tin roof, it wasn't particularly comfortable. There are those factors. But I suppose it comes back to visual delight, a lot of it, which I'd sort of had instilled in me a bit, I think, possibly from my old dad. And my brother and I used to take delight in baiting him by saying, "Oh, it's beautiful."
But was it the visual delight of the buildings themselves or your photographic images ultimately?
Oh, well, the reason I took, the photos, suddenly I realised that people, Fritz, in fact, we look at things and we do not see them. And he taught us, we've got to look and see what we're looking at, and so forth. And so I, of course, became aware of that in the public realm. They have a magnificent building which quite cheerfully gets knocked over, and nobody seems to think it was any chop. And then I see a picture of it and I said, oh, crikey. And so I thought, put a frame around it and say, hey, look at this. It's like, Deschamps putting the urinal up on the wall and so forth. So I thought, this is one way of getting a message across. Things that have been disregarded as part of the environment that you didn't take much notice of. Suddenly when you, hey, reconsider this, by putting a frame around it. And that was one of my great motivations.
What about the light? The photographer, it's what you're working with, isn't it? And those early photographs you're talking about, Townsville out of Charters Town and so on. It's a pretty harsh, strong light.
Yeah.
It must make for some challenges for a photographer.
It certainly does. But every light has its challenge, and you become aware that depending on the light, you take a different sort of photograph.
I was thinking about the deep shadow, because one of the things that Langer thought was wrong about the Queensland house was they were so dark.
Yeah.
Because people close them off against the heat, the verandas are deep, so the room's always back from the veranda. Yeah. But I mean, his concern was then it becomes very glary because you're in a dark house and you're looking out to a very bright house.
Paintings.
And so that sort of that deep shadow he saw was sort of like problematic because it made for glare. Yeah. But in your photographs, I think you really celebrate those sort of those shadows.
Well, I suppose I was born here. Whereas Carl came from a gentler light, but I found that you learn very quickly what will photograph and what won't. And if you're particularly interested in doing something, you learn how to modify your approach to suit the light. But some lighting system is better than others. But if you're taking portraits, for instance, you're not looking for strong shadows at all. You don't want any of the crow's feet and all the rest of it. But it's good for showing the modelling on buildings. And I think it might have been David Saunders, somebody saying that the ornamentation on buildings in Europe was much more chunky to get shadows and so forth because the light there is so much softer. Whereas in Australia, with the harder light, you can get modelling and elevation, etc., with smaller variations in surface. So there's a bit of you just learn to modify your technique to deal with deep shadows, basically, and that is the film is made for Europe, basically, or the Northern Hemisphere. If you process your negatives in a particular way, you can make them a much softer contrast range. And also when you print, you can enhance areas and you can hold back areas. And so the shadows just generally mean you're modifying your approach. And occasionally a shadow beats you, but you think, well, a shadow is a shadow, and you just go along with it. If you can't beat it, you accept it. It's a bit like when telegraph wires and all the rest of it, you try to dodge the blooming things, but eventually, you find you can't dodge them, so you just incorporate them as well as you can into the result.
But do you think that the quality of light is something that the Queensland architecture does?
Yes.
Play with consciously or unconsciously?
Well, initially it was unconsciously, I think. It was when I went to Tasmania, and I was really surprised when the bridge was down at that stage and I had to go right in the bus trip round, and it was a long twilight and there were these ragged skies with wonderful light coming through them. And it was quite mind-blowing, and I suddenly realised why there was such a big school of landscape photographers in Tasmania, because it's not just the see these fantastic skies and light they have down there, whereas Queensland, you know, was a bit more of a sledgehammer technique. But sort of I was born in the Victorian country and so forth, so I was quite used to hard life, basically, I suppose.
In response to Deborah's question, you said that you weren't showing any contemporary buildings that you think were influenced by this type of architecture, but were there architects in Queensland at the time that were doing works that were clearly influenced by these type of Queensland houses that had been built before, according to you?
Well, it's a difficult question, and there's so many facets to it, but basically I felt that it was, you didn't have to build a Baroque building, you know, to pay homage or express your liking of the past. The thing to match was the quality, and that was quite important. There was one grand house that I went to, and the lady was interested in getting a fountain in the front garden, and I said, "You've got a lovely place here, a lovely stone building." I said, "Your real job is to match the quality of this place." It was a 1800s number, and you know, and just stick with what is currently available. And I said, Norma Redpath is currently over in Italy studying in the Italian foundries. You'd be better not getting an 18th century Colebrookdale fountain, which you'd have a lot of trouble getting. You'd be better commissioning Norma Redpath to do you a quality piece. And there's only 200 years difference, you know, where you look at Albi Cathedral, you know, which, how long was that building? 500 years or something? Albi, you know, there's bits and pieces, you know, there's the plain brickwork, and then there's that fantastic porch on it. And, you know, that they're all of a similar quality, and therefore they all gel together. Yeah, so does that answer the question?
Partially.
When you think about people like Rex Addison, who he got his own house in near here, Cambridge, 75, I think.
Yeah.
It looks a little bit like your image there.
Yeah.
And he'd been playing around with similar ideas in PNG,
That's
I think,
right,
before that.
These earthquake buildings.
And you know, Russell Hall started doing similar kinds of things.
Yeah.
And Don Watson, for that matter, in his practice. Do you think those things are come out of the kind of interest that you had, along with the other guys at the time?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it came out. I think we're all mutually interested in it. It's. I think we supported each other, but you know, I think I got people aware of fretwork in Queensland. Well, you're not really.
Like batten screens and
No, the decorative things which are now done with laser cutters.
Yes.
And
used to be done with a fret saw.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah, and so that was an exhibition I had at the U of Q in the Art Museum when Nancy Underhill was running the place. Fretwork pediments, and it was all that was influenced by the Beckers.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right.
Because I had a formula for photographing each one. I was trying to submerge me.
Yeah, just be very objective.
Yeah, be very objective. I try to submerge me a lot.
Yes.
You know, but I mean you can't. But I try to present a photograph to a person that they say, this is a genuine photograph, it's not a construct, it's a genuine photograph of something that's genuinely there. That is standard Queensland light, that is standard colour, there's no jiggery pokery here, there's no magic filters, it's taken from a person standing outside looking at it. He's not lying in the gutter looking up at it like that. You know, I think I try to photograph architecture as it is experienced. to give people a really accurate idea of what the building is. And I do dislike the twilight photos where the lights all switched on, you can see what's inside, and it camouflages all the garbage outside. You know, it's
the real estate agent shot all until 6
Yeah.
p.m. with the.
yeah, they're anathema, you know.
Yes.
But Richard, those photographs of yours that we have at the uni, the prints, you
Yeah.
said they're not from this exhibition. What exhibition were they from?
Well, you've got me. I've got a list of all my
They're on skinny
exhibitions.
hardboard,
Yeah,
and they look like they've been mounted in the same way with.
yeah, that's
Old
right.
ones.
Yeah, that was my standard system.
Seems
I've
like a
got
similar idea.
Yeah. They were later ones.
Would they be some of the
There
same?
might be some of the vanishing. I've got lists of the prints that were in each exhibition. Yeah. For instance, Vanishing Queens had a Charterstown. Well, they obviously had that one there, but there was the Charterstown Stock Exchange, the house at Charters Towers. God, there was a house at Coolum, when you drove. Sorry, at Janina when you're on the Coolum Road, farmhouse that I liked.
So you don't recall if the prints that we've got are from the same, some of them from the same negs, or
I can tell you. I mean, I've got it written down that bit.
Okay.
So I can tell you without too much trouble.
So you obviously did quite a number of these exhibitions over a number of
Yes.
years, yeah?
There was a big trouble with an exhibition in that, with the sales tax, basically. In the sales tax in those days was 10% or 40% of the gross. And you had to, you could buy your goods by production of a sales tax certificate, and so you bought the goods cheaper. But then, of course, you had to pay this amount, the surcharge to the taxation department, which was, of course, tax on finished goods, which meant, in point of fact, they made more money that way than if I'd paid tax when I was buying goods and didn't have to buy anymore. Now, the effect of that was that they would say, well, you use some of this material for photographing your children, don't you? And you've done prints of them too, haven't you? Yes. Now, did you pay tax on those? So there was this notion of goods for your own use. You know, if you put a photograph in your window promoting your business, etc. In effect, you'd sold it to yourself, hadn't you? So therefore, they wanted their cut. So it meant if you had an exhibition, in addition to all the cost of getting it together, that you had then, and of course photographs are not, they don't sell like oil paintings or anything of that nature. So you just cross your fingers that you might sell one or two. That's a big win, you know. But of course, hang on a tick, they're all goods for your own use. You're promoting your business, aren't you, by having an exhibition? You really want, let me see, it works out at another $2,000 or something or other. And of course, that is really inhibiting. And so you had to work out ways of beating this. Now, if you produced a work of art, you're exempt from that business. But the taxation department knew if they said that photographs could be works of art, overnight everybody in Australia would be taking for works of art instead of photographs. So you didn't have much hope there. Jeff Parr in Tasmania, he had an exhibition, I remember, where he'd annotated the photographs and put little bits of embellishment with Indian ink and so forth. But the result was awful.
We forgot to ask, did you sell any photographs from this exhibition?
Occasionally, friends occasionally would buy one or two.
And was there a numbered edition, or
No,
just sold?
That's another part of my philosophy. Photography is hang on. Numbered editions Of course, if you've only got one oil painting, well, that's that, you know, and its value as such. And there's this sort of snob idea that, you know, when you've got 20 etchings, well, that's it. You know, you're one of 20 people. So therefore, each individual one is not worth as much as a good, decent oil painting. So you number them, you know, just to make sure that somebody else doesn't slip one in, etc., etc. Now, of course, the real constraint on all that was because an etching plate is only good for about 100 prints. If you're doing dry points, you're good for about 20. If you're doing lithographs, on the other hand, you know, you can have much larger editions. So there's this pegging order in worth. But when it comes to photographs, you know, I can produce thousands of images off one image, one negative. So therefore, the value of each one is not worth that much because anybody can have one of those. But I see photography not from that point of view. I see photography as a great enabling medium, where if you like something, I can write off to the Library of Congress and I can get a print off of Walker Evans. Now, it's not necessarily by Walker Evans' hand, but it might be a guy who could print better than Walker Evans. So, you know, it's... but the thing is, I've got one of these images that I admired, and all right, maybe the guy would imitate Ansel Adams or whatever. So what's the difference between one that's actually signed by him, where one that's identical that's not signed by him, and yeah, purely that little signature? So I think it's purely a snob thing, and I think photographs should not have edition numbers. I think the only limits on photography is when you get sick of printing the bloody thing. So most I've ever got up to would be about 10 or so, you know. And that is a very real limit of when you get sick of doing something. And then occasionally, the other nice thing of photography is that one day you're in a black and white mood, and the next day you're buoyant, or the next day you're miserable, and so forth. And it can all reflect. And you can say, oh, I was printing that way 10 years ago, I'm not doing that now, I'll have a different way I like doing, all that sort of thing. So they're capable of many interpretations, and that's another one of my theories, that a good picture can be looked at time and time again. The same picture, and you can each time get a different message depending on the mood you're in. And you can't do that with a poster. A poster's got a single message. But a really good picture, you can just sit and look at it and look at it and look at it. And that's, I remember Wilson Hall in Melbourne, which was where they used to do the grease ceremonies. It was burnt down, they got a new one, and Tom Bass and Douglas Annan did this huge mural, you know? And I thought, isn't that fabulous? You can sit there a whole degree ceremony looking at that mural and not get tired. Wow.
Just going back to your exhibitions, did you do any exhibitions on more contemporary work in Queensland, or was it more the historic material?
It's been more historic. It's a bias to historic. But it hasn't stopped me from doing contemporary. I particularly like the patina of age, and contemporary work, when it's contemporary, doesn't have that. Later on it will accumulate that. Occasionally it starts falling to bits, which means it's no good, and of course with varnished timber, after a year or so the varnish starts falling off, and it's not what it was intended. You know, it's not intended to age gracefully.
But you did do contemporary work for magazines and for architectural offices?
Concrete Review. Well, was it the Concrete Quarterly or the Concrete Review? That nice Cement and Concrete Association.
The Concrete Review, I think,
Yeah. They were good magazines. So
were you doing that work already in the late 60s, or was that later?
Yeah. Started then. we having a coffee break or?
We can just.
We just keep recording or
No,
stop?
Oh, I don't mind.
If you have more questions, Deb, I don't know. I don't have any more questions.
So at the end of my questions, really.
Oh, right. Well, it seems
Deborah?
like a good time for coffee.
Well, I suppose my only last question was because you talked about this exhibition as being sort of architecture without architects, and you sort of knowing the Melbourne scene.
Well, well, hang on a tick. That most of it was buildings by architects.
I agree.
Was,
yeah.
That was that was the wild card factor. You know, have you considered these? You know, you have a look at them.
So this was the wild card factor, but then you had other more prominent architectural examples within it. Yeah. I'm just wondering if that sort of idea of sort of establishing Queensland practice as architecture proper, was that sort of a big concern within the scene at the time, especially in sort of considering its relationship to other places like Melbourne and Sydney and.
Well, I certainly was with the students. I think there were certain firms that were moribund, though, and they were just interested in the daily routine of doing drawings. And when I left, there was all the nice louvers I'd taken the trouble to get right round the whole building, round the back of it. They were replaced. Nobody goes round the back was a quote. Nobody goes round the back except bulls and bastards.
Wow.
Well, that was a typical Queensland thing you did encounter. And in Carl, I think, Langer, who he preached, the gospel of human kindness and all that sort of thing. I think a lot of people resented that, because he said there were other things besides the daily bread and butter routine. But I think it was the cultural cringe with Queensland in those days. It was seen very much as a place where nothing was happening. And when I was doing work with a trust, you got your feeling when you went to a trust interstate meeting, you were there, because, well, we're Australian, aren't we? And we've got to have people from up north, even though nothing's happening there. And I think then Joe Pearson came along, and I can remember one conference, there was some issue came up, and I was part of the Queensland delegation, and we all nodded in agreement, and everybody looked at each other. They expected us to get our shoes out and start banging the table and making it to the Khrushchev. It was quite interesting, this sort of, So does that answer the question? No.
Just a detail. When did you go to work with the trust?
Fairly early. It was when I went. I really did like looking at Queensland and Marguerite. Before we had our kids, we both used to get in our mini miner and head off, just exploring. And we got as far as Cooktown in the mini miner, which was quite an achievement in those days. And I saw the convent there, which had been abandoned by the nuns when the war came, and they went off to Herberton and never came back. And I looked at it and thought, what a wonderful building, solid brick, and it had lasted because it was so well built. And I thought, something's got to be done about that. It's a really lovely building. And so I went to Sir Raphael Salento, who was sort of king of the infant trust here. I had done a bit of work in the National Trust in Melbourne, by the way, so I was familiar with sort of trustee things. And I said to him, the building up at Cooktown is very nice. Can something happen with it? And it was not it's not who you know, it's not where you, not what you say, not what you do, but it's where you happen to stand in a moment of time. And I actually stood in the right spot because Sir Raphael was looking for something to do for the Queen's visit when she came out here. And suddenly here was a project that the Queen could, an attainable project. And so that went ahead, and the convent got restored and turned into the James Cook Historical Museum. But I went up initially after seeing him, and went up and I did a condition report on the building, and came back and was saying, look, it's structurally sound, you can do it. So the Works Department then went ahead and did it. Not exactly the way I would have liked it to have been done, but I did stop them from putting a better block toilet out the front.
And you remained involved with the trust?
Yeah, for a fair while. I was chair of a listings committee for a fair while, in the beginning when it was easy. Eventually though, it was the politics of the place. You know, here's so much out there to be done, and what are they doing? They're fighting each other. And I just got sick of it. You know, and I thought it's human nature with organisations that there's fights and there's camps. And I remember the Melbourne Architecture School had two camps. There was those who were for Prof and those who were against him. There was one guy who was outside all this. One guy who everybody respected. Fritz. Fritz knew his things so well that he didn't have to be in any camp. You know, it's a bit like Brahms. You know, all the classicists and the romanticists. They all wanted to have Brahms in their camp. You know, but you know, and I thought if one can be outside all this squabbling and jockeying position, and so I've been an anti-organisation person all my way. But it has its downside in that you haven't got a guaranteed salary yet, and you haven't got lots of little students who will give you bags of information, and you can go to the trust and lay out all this research, and here you are, all you've got is your two hands. So no, I envy you, John, with these resources.
Trying to make opportunities for people.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks very much, Richard.
Oh, pleasure. Thank